Hello, everyone. This is Alexander Horat with the Free American Press, and today we're having a very special guest back on the show, and his name is Joseph P Farrell. He is a researcher, and he's actually written quite a few different books. Hello, Joseph. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me back, Alex.
Oh, cool. So one of the things that's really concerning me and a lot of people is the war going on in Ukraine, which the U.S. is helping them against Russia. And there's been
hmm
some talks about nuclear war for a long time, but now they're saying that the START nuclear pact was actually suspended uh,
hmm
just today. So I just want to
hmm
see kind of your thoughts on the on this war and what's going on, and if you think there could be a possible nuclear war, if that's something in the cards of what they want to do. Um,
Well, it's it's important to put President Putin's remarks into context of the rest of his speech. Um, this is something he said a number of things that he started to say around 2012, I think, when he started talking about the current decadence of not only Western culture but of the Western political leadership. So if you go back and listen to that speech, Putin was literally telling the truth in that the Western leadership seems less interested about protecting its own children and subjecting them to all sorts of wokery than it was protecting its own citizenry from those things. And we saw a glaring example of this with, I'll be honest, I've got no use for the man, so I call him Bidenenko, or sometimes Biden Joe, Baiden, kind of a Chinese spelling
yeah.
of his name. But we saw this in spades in the fact that he has no time to go visit the people in Ohio and even talk about that disaster, but he's got enough time to fly over to Kiev, meet with that clown Zelensky, and promise him yet another $500 million worth of military aid that probably isn't going to make it there in time anyway.
Hmm.
Um, so Putin withdrawing from the START talks, what else could he do? We are the ones that pushed the Ukraine into this war by overturning President Yankovich, who was duly and properly elected and a moderately pro-Russian guy. We installed for want of a better expression, a neo-Nazi regime when we overthrew Yankovich back in 2014. We have since crossed all the red lines that Russia has warned us not to cross. And here we are. We've got a criminal, and I do not mince words here. We've got a criminal, treasonous grifter in the White House who is mad enough, insane enough to, in order to protect his own behind and some of the things that he and his family have done in the Ukraine, is willing to go to this extreme. So, do I view nuclear war as a possibility? If the insane people in Washington do not reverse course, yes, it's a possibility. Now, that said, do the sane people, if there are any left in the swamp, do the sane people want a war? No, they don't. The United States and particularly the American military knows it is simply not prepared for a major direct confrontation with Russia. We just simply can't do it. If you look back at the American military track record since the end of World War II, we have not confronted any military power in our own league. And yet we've still managed to lose virtually every conflict that we've been embroiled in: Afghanistan, Vietnam, and at best stalemate in Korea. So if you're a sane military person, what do? You try and get out of this mess as best as you can. Unfortunately, I think that Biden has personal, here's the problem. Biden has personal reasons for keeping the United States ratcheting up the tension with Russia. So in other words, this is beyond a purely geopolitical fight right now. There are personal motivations that this misadministration has for keeping us in the fight. I feel sorry for the Ukrainians. Um, they didn't want this war any more than the Russians wanted it. But unfortunately, their government has been taken literally captive and hostage by the coup d'etat back in 2014. And it's basically an American puppet. And that's the problem. Um, this is not going to end well for the United States because in the process, Seymour Hersh has published his article about the United States most likely being uh, behind the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage. I'm from the Vietnam era, Alex, and I remember Seymour Hersh for exposing the My Lai massacre and his role in the Watergate affair and so on. So, I have a great deal of respect for the man. And when he says something like this, I tend to sit up and listen. So if what his article says is true, and again, I'm not doubting that it is, then this country also committed an act of war against its major European ally, and that's Germany. So my word, how much more insane can we be? Pissing off Germany is not a country you want to piss off, as we've learned to our chagrin twice in the last century. So, this is madness. That's all I can say about it. It's total madness.
Do you think the elites of the world want a nuclear war, or do you think that's probably something that's not going to be happening?
I think that there are certain people that are so totally captivated with all sorts of nihilistic evil that, yeah, that they would welcome a nuclear war, but I think they're few and far between. Um, I think you have to look in certain very narrow circles at the top of every nation's deep state. But any sane person would not, doesn't want that. But you have within certain elite circles, you have all these people that think that we're overpopulated, and what better way to get rid of a significant segment of the world population than a nuclear war?
Right.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I think there are people that crazy. Yes.
So, what do you think is the end game of this war is going to be? What do you think is the most likely scenario? Do you think Russia will take over all of Ukraine? Will it continue to be a stalemate, or some other
Well,
disaster?
let me take issue with you there. I don't view this war as a stalemate.
Okay.
I, whatever propaganda the Western media is putting out, it's not a stalemate. Russia is clobbering the Ukraine. There's just, I mean, anybody who thinks the Ukraine is winning this war, much less manage to stalemate this war, no, that's not happening. Um, Russia is playing this whole thing very, very cautiously and wisely from a military point of view. They forced the Ukraine into the very worst type of war that they could have fought, and that's a war of attrition. You know, let me give the illustration of the World War One Battle of Versailles, or of Verdun. In World War One, the Germans decided to go on a major offensive on the Western Front in 1916 at the French city of Verdun, which the Germans knew the French would defend to the last drop, which is exactly what happened. That's what the French ended up doing. And as a result of the battle, both the French and the Germans lost somewhere between 430 and 460,000 soldiers killed in that one battle over the few months that it was fought. Now, that may look like more or less a stalemate, but here's the gruesome arithmetic of it. France at the beginning of World War I had a population of approximately 30 million. Germany at the beginning of World War I had approximately a population of 60 million. In other words, about double that of France. So in other words, if you're taking the population as the context in which to interpret those casualty figures from Verdun, the Germans, by killing 400 some odd thousand Frenchmen, were really killing twice as many because France could not afford to lose as much as Germany. So in other words, the figures are distorted. Now look at the Ukraine and Russia. Russia has a population of about 125 million, the Ukraine about 40, and that's really pushing the numbers. So the Ukraine cannot even afford to lose the amounts of troops and soldiers and materiel that they're losing. On top of this, the German and American aid that is supposedly being supplied. I mean, I'm looking at numbers, Alex, that are ridiculous. 50 German Leopard 2 tanks is not going to turn this around. That's at best an armored battalion, maybe if you push it a bit, a regiment. That's not enough to stop the Russians. No way. And the final problem is this. The Russians have not gutted their manufacturing base. Every weapon system in the Russian military is made within Russia, entirely within Russia, and in Russian factories by Russians. Their entire logistical system is Russia-based. If you look, on the other hand, to the west, our tank, our main battle tank, the M1A1 Abrams, has components or equipment that are actually not American. The gun on the tank is German.
Wow.
And most Americans don't even know that. It's a German gun. So the problem here is that you've got a country, Russia, that has not stopped its industry and shipped it all overseas. And you have that in the West, and particularly in this country. We don't make anything completely in this country anymore. Our computer chips are coming from where? China.
Yeah.
Okay. And by the way, if you're waiting for that computer chip factory in Ohio to open up, well, keep waiting, folks. You know, the train wreck is right there in that region. So here's the problem. The Ukraine is expending, I read somewhere, maybe 6,000 to 8,000 rounds of artillery projectiles every day.
Yeah.
Russia, and it's running out of ammunition, and the NATO allies, Germany, the Dutch, I think somewhere involved in there, the Norwegians, are saying that, you know, our ammo stocks are depleted. We can't resupply you. And we can't, the United States. Russia, Alex, has been expending on anywhere from 30 to 60,000 artillery rounds per day.
Yeah.
And they're nowhere near exhausted. So if these idiots in Swampington, D.C. want to pick a fight with Moscow, they've got one.
So
You
how,
know?
how long do you think the war will last? And do you think Russia will go for complete victory? And do you think there's possibility other European powers could enter the war more directly?
Here's what I expect to happen.
Okay.
Russia has already announced that they're planning for a 30-month-long war against NATO. They're making no bones about it. And when they say that, what they're really saying is, yeah, we realize we're in a de facto war with the United States, and, you know, we're preparing for a 30-month-long conventional war. Now, when the Russians say that, they mean it.
Yeah.
That's exactly what they're preparing for, and that's exactly what they'll be able to do. We are nowhere anywhere close to being able to do that. Nowhere close. So I'll tell you what's going to happen. Once the Russians have taken out, and this is my best guess, once the Russians have taken out what little remains of Ukrainian air defenses and really begin a war of maneuver rather than a war of attrition, which is what they've been fighting thus far. Once they begin that, there is little incentive for the Russians to stop.
Right.
The only thing that's going to stop them, perhaps, is when the European powers wake up and realize that the longer they follow this country into oblivion, the worse off they are. And we've already managed to piss off the Germans with the Nord Stream pipeline. I'm looking for, quite frankly, for the Europeans to just say enough is enough. We are going to step in and help negotiate a peace, and Washington, D.C. be damned.
Hmm.
That's exactly what's going to. We're watching, I think, the beginning of the end for NATO and the post-war system of alliances. And quite frankly, I think it's high time. If I were any European power, looking at the way this country has handled and treated the Ukraine, I would be absolutely done with it as an ally.
So
We have done nothing but spread wokery and misery and dropped bombs all over the world, and nobody else wants it, and I don't blame them.
So what do you think if Russia wins in Ukraine? What do you think their next step will be? I heard might just be propaganda, but I heard something that
Oh no.
they were thinking about putting Belarus inside the Russian Federation directly. I don't know if
Well,
putting
I wouldn't be surprised if Belarus and the Russian Federation itself reach some sort of more formal arrangement. Because if you're sitting there in Minsk, if you're in Belarus and you've watched this circus unfold in the Ukraine, largely at the behest of American bungling, incompetence, greed, and evil, and I'm totally honest with my feelings there.
yeah.
If you've been watching that circus, would you want it to happen to Belarus? No, no, absolutely not. So I think the chances are very good that something like that would happen. I think the country to watch right now is Poland.
Okay.
And the reason why is that Putin himself has made statements along the lines that, well, much of what is today the Ukraine used to be part of Poland. And he's indicated that he's entirely happy with the idea that if Poland wants to claim some of that territory back, fine with him. So in other words, I think what he's really trying to signal with all of his references to Poland is they would be welcomed, let's put it that way, as moderators at a peace talk if they wanted to do that. The only thing that Putin is concerned about with Poland is precisely Poland's claims on Belarus and so on and so forth. So in other words, Putin, I think, is very carefully ratcheting up not just the military pressure on the Ukraine, he's very carefully ratcheting up the pressure that the European powers can put on the Ukraine. And at the same time, he's playing this country for all it's worth. And Bidenenko is not clever enough to realize it. Whatever Biden's trip to Kiev was, it was meant as a stunt to take the thunder away from Putin's speech, which was going to be the next day. That's
Oh,
what that
right.
was about.
That makes
And,
sense.
and the other thing that it was about, I quite honestly think, is that Bidenenko is worried about his friend Zelensky not going to the negotiating table. Biden needs a way out of this. I mean, he's the one that has stuck us there beyond Victoria Nuland, and he needs a way out. And he needs a way out. Let's remember, well, I called them up and said if they don't appoint that prosecutor, then they don't get their $1 billion. Well, what do you know?
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
Biden is now in the seat that he tried to put the Ukrainians in.
Hmm.
Stop and think about the leverage that Zelensky may have over Biden.
Yeah, so one thing that I know from history is that Poland was for a long time part of Russia, so you don't think
Yeah.
Russia would try for Poland too?
No, no. The Russians learned their lesson with trying to run a multi-ethnic centralized state under the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
And if anything taught them a lesson, you don't want to mess with the Poles, because the Poles are the ones that began the unraveling of the Warsaw Pact. Let us be frank and honest and remember that. So no, I don't think the Russians want that kind uh of headache, quite frankly. And they've been very clear about the Ukraine all along. They are not wanting to occupy all of the Ukraine. They simply want to keep the Ukraine out of NATO and a neutral country without any forward basing of American missiles or anything like that. And of course, we ignored them. So when this offensive really gets underway, how far do I think the Russians will go? I think they will go as far as Western panic allows them to go. In other words, once this starts, the United States is going to try to stop the Russian advance by saying, "Okay, we'll negotiate," and watch what will happen. They
yeah,
will put they will put conditions, or attempt to put conditions, preconditions on what we want before we will even sit down and talk with the Russians. The Russians will not listen to that.
yeah. And I also believe doesn't Moldova they have like another separate state that is like likes the Russians? So do you think there's a possibility of anything happening in Moldova or
Well, Moldova used to be a part of the Russian Empire. So you've got a significant Russian population there. Odessa is the other really major port that used to be part of Russia that's on the Black Sea, Sevastopol being the principal one in the Crimea. But Odessa is the other large Russian population center in that part of the world. I don't see the Russians uh, stopping short of including Moldova in their plans. If you look where the Russian troops are stationed right now, getting ready for this big offensive,
yeah,
they're in the southeastern part of the Ukraine. In other words, they're north of the Crimea, over the Sea of Azov. So, in other words, what they're doing is they're getting ready for a big push from the southeast to the northwest up to the Dnieper River, and then, in my estimation, probably on over west of the Dnieper into Moldova. So, and I've listened to Scott Ritter and Colonel McGregor, and that's basically what they're saying as well, with the way the Russian troop dispositions are right now. So yeah, I don't see anything really that can stop the Russians. Um, we're going to have to accept the fact that this is one that the West has lost. It remains to be seen whether the nutcases in Swampington, D.C. are going to accede to that.
mm,
Um,
oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead. No,
Oh,
go
I was
ahead.
just I was just gonna say one thing I saw too is that Finland is breaking their neutrality that they've had for a long time, saying that they want to join NATO. And I know Russia's fought with Finland multiple times.
Yes,
So
yes.
I think there's anything on that front. That's really the only other country that.
Well, again, that's Finland is a sore point. If you go back to the Russo-Finnish War, just immediately prior to the German invasion in World War II, what Stalin was after was, again, even Joseph Stalin knew better than to try and retake all of Finland. Finland was a part of the Russian Empire up to the end of World War One. So in other words, at the beginning of World War One, what is now Finland wasn't there. Okay. At the end of World War One, Finland fought free of the Soviets, and they ended up with a border. If you go back and look at the pre-Russo-Finnish border, they ended up with a border that was quite literally within a stone's throw of St. Petersburg, or what became Leningrad, and then a considerable portion of the Karelian Peninsula. All right.
Right.
When Stalin went to war, his objective in that war was not to take over Finland. His objective was to push the border back from Leningrad and from Petropavlovsk in the Karelian Peninsula, which eventually he was able to get the Finns to agree to. That was his objective. So if you look at the way the Russians have been approaching the Finns, they've been telling the Finns the same thing. Don't become part of NATO. And thank goodness Turkey has been standing up and saying, no, we're not going to let you join NATO.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think this Ukrainian war would have been escalated already into a pan-European war. And wow, surprise, surprise. Erdogan says no to Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and then Turkey gets hit with an earthquake.
Yeah.
Which
you think that might have something to do with it, huh?
Oh yes, absolutely, I do. Yeah,
It was a pretty big earthquake. I is that area hit by natural earthquakes very often?
Oh yeah, it's on a natural fault line. Yes, absolutely. The nice thing about having weather technology and earthquake technology is
Yeah.
you can always blame it on acts of God.
Right.
Always. It's plausible deniability par excellence. But here's the problem. It's the timing of things that you've got to watch.
Yeah.
Rewind the tape back on Fukushima and what was going on in Japan prior to Fukushima. Well, prior to Fukushima, the Japanese had elected a new government. They had made overtures to China to let the emperor of Japan make a state visit to China. Now,
Yeah.
that's, folks, I don't know if you understand how significant that is. The
Yeah.
Japanese were trying to bury a very long and old hatchet, and the Chinese were actually considering it.
Yeah.
And on top of that, the Japanese foreign minister made another appeal to the United States to shut down its base on Okinawa because, American soldiers have been behaving not the best way towards the local Japanese population ever since the end of the war. It's been a sticking point with the Japanese. So prior to the Fukushima incident, Obama's Secretary of Defense, the only Republican holdover in his administration, Robert Gates, quite literally issued a threat to Japan. And many people forget this, but he issued a threat to Japan. You might want to change course or there will be serious consequences. Japan didn't change course. The Fukushima meltdown and tsunami happened, and the government was replaced with Shinzo Abe.
So, do you think the West could use these types of weather weapons on Russia?
Sure.
Do you think they might do that?
Again, it's hard to tell because we're dealing with insane, desperate people in charge of this country. We're dealing with people that don't know how to define a woman. They're nuts. So I don't know. The temptation is there, but the problem is the big problem is we don't know what Russia has.
Right, that's true.
Remember what Dmitry Medvedev said a month before the Chelyabinsk meteor incident? He went on Russian television and basically made a plea for all the major powers of the world to get together and build an asteroid defense system. And then he went on to say, but if no one will agree to do this with us, we're just going to have to build out our own. And then the reporter asked Medvedev, well, how would you defend against asteroids? And he said, well, we can defend against them using our nuclear missiles. And then he said something very significant right at the end of that. He said, or we have other means of doing so.
Huh.
Okay. What other means, Dimitri?
Yeah.
And the reporter, didn't follow up with that obvious question. So in other words, I view that interview as him sending messages. He was sending a message that we have other stuff, folks, and we're not telling you about it. Now, is that a bluff? Maybe, but it's a bad idea to play bluff poker with Russians.
And,
Okay.
and that's actually you hit on a point that one of my friends is really worried about is possible meteor strike on the world or something to that effect. I don't know if you know have any thoughts on that.
Well, I've written about it many times. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Carol Rosen, but she was a close associate with Dr. Werner von Braun. And toward the end of his life, you can go read about this. I've blogged about it on my website several times.
Right.
But she took out an affidavit that was first published by Dr. Stephen Greer in his book Disclosure. And Dr. Rosen knew Werner von Braun since they were both working for Fairchild Industries at the time. And she said that von Braun told her that they were going to weaponize space and they were going to create different reasons at different times in history in order to do it. The first one was going to be communist. We need to have a space defense missile shield.
All right.
The next one was going to be terrorists. We need to protect ourselves from terrorist weapons. The next was going to be nations of concern, like guess who? Iran, North Korea, and so on. The next threat that they were going to talk about for weaponizing space would be asteroids.
Mm.
So, in other words, folks, we're in the asteroid stage right now,
Right.
and coming out of it because the final stage was going to be extraterrestrials.
Yes. Yes.
So here we are.
And that's what they've been saying about these weather balloons. Like,
oh, come on!
Stuff. They're trying
China, China does not need
weather balloons.
Balloons.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. They've been talking about these balloons for like months. That's like 1800s technology. Like you think they could use
the Chinese have anywhere from 80 to 100 spy satellites. They don't need balloons to do this, for crying out loud. And even if they were spying on us with balloons, they still have to have whatever signals the balloons are gathering, either by shortwave radio transmitting to China or by satellite relay. So why bother with the balloon?
So you hit on a really good point. So so for my last question, when do you think the fake alien invasion's coming?
Look, at this point, I don't put anything past these people, Alex, because if you go back and look at the way these nutcases have been handling ufology and the UFO issue, is they are trying to prep, in my opinion, the ET invasion threat narrative.
Yes.
Nothing else is working for them. Tell me that the average Californian where you live is worried about the Ukraine war.
Well, that's a good point. They've been doing something very weird in California as they, the
surprise, doing something weird in California.
The Rockefeller Foundation has been funding these things called resiliency centers.
Oh, for crying out loud.
And what I think, they don't have like any specific use. They're for emergencies. So I think they're just like some sort of processing center to ship people off.
Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah.
Yeah, ding. Yeah, yeah. They've been prepping all of this stuff for a very long time, but I think they're prepping a narrative, an ET threat narrative, for a variety of reasons. And it just, they create threats for their political purpose.
Right.
It would make sense to create an ET threat of people that look like us, walk like us, and quack like us. So in order to tell the difference, we're going to have to sample your DNA and microchip you to be
Yeah.
able to tell you apart from ET. Well, call me a fundamentalist, but that sounds an awful lot like the beast system.
Well,
So,
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's what they're heading to next, especially with Elon
oh
Musk
yeah.
saying that he wants to put a chip in everybody's brain. But
Sorry, Ellen. Look at what they've done with him. They've made him play the role of Mr. Conservative concerned with free speech savior.
yeah,
In
and
other
that's
words,
such a lie because
of
everything
course it is.
they're doing is completely against it, and it makes me so upset that so many people believe that. Like on the radio, blares it. It's like upsetting, honestly. Like people
Folks,
should know better.
American talk radio is no longer what it used to be.
Yeah.
And you can